you are a descendant of Violet Roberts, if you guys would all stand, please. If you're a descendant of Violet Roberts, so take a look around, because all those people who are standing, you may not have ever met them, but you guys are cousins. And that's one of the benefits of honoring one of Joseph Roberts' kids, is that you get to meet people that you may not have known that you are relatives. So I'm glad you're here, and I hope I do Violet justice. And if I'm wrong, you guys can all correct me. But welcome to Robert's Switch. And in attendance, we also, of course, have Frances Marion Roberts represented here also. So if you're a Frances Marion Roberts descendant, if you would stand. If you're a Frances Marion Roberts descendant. All right, Doris, thank you. Connie, there we go. All right, so you guys are also Violet Roberts. Her father and mother were Joseph and Rachel, Joseph Roberts, Rachel Carter, and they got married and they lived down on the creek bottom down here. You guys were there yesterday, down there at the bottom, and they had what we know of as 11 kids. Violet was the 9th of 11 kids. Her closest sister was Melissa Roberts. She was the older sister, then came Violet. And then after Violet was Frances Marion Roberts. That was, by age, that was her closest sibling. And we'll talk more about that, because I think that they had a special bond that evidence kind of supports that maybe they were close. After Frances Marion Roberts, her next sibling, the youngest, was Joseph Denton Roberts, who ends up living near where Violet Roberts lived. And we also think that there was a connection with them, more than being just brother and sister, but they were neighbors, and I think there was also evidence of connection there as well. So they're living down there. Violet is born in 1833, and she's down there, and everybody's happy. They're living down on the creek bottom, working hard, enjoying life. Things are going well. And in the 1840 census, all of Joseph Roberts, everybody is captured. And that's how we know that they were living down there on the creek bottom. And but then unfortunately, some things happen while they're living down there. Violet's brother William dies when she's 8 years old. And then when Violet is 15 years old, her mother dies. Rachel dies. And so at that point in time, in the 1850 census, Joseph has remarried, and her go-by name was Polly, and she was Mary Merritt, but she went by Polly. And Violet lived there with Frances Marion and Joseph Denton. And I kind of wonder, Violet was 15 years old, and this is, sometimes when I say I was wondering, that means there's no evidence to support this. So don't quote me on this, but I kind of wonder if Violet felt kind of like a little mom to Frances Marion and Joseph Denton, because she was 15, she has a new stepmom, they're living down there in the creek, and maybe she had to help a lot raising her 2 little brothers, and maybe there was a special bond just because of that. That's just me surmising. Well, she's down there, and springtime comes, and the bubbies are coming up. Sweet Betsy's are smelling pretty good, and she's down there in the creek bottom. And on Minelet Creek was also John Wesley Lee's family lived down there. And I can just imagine she's down there walking along the creek bottom, and she sees John Wesley Lee. And they end up falling in love and getting married on the 1st of September, 1853. And we know this because we have Civil War affidavits that they were married on that date. And even though the records have been burnt, we have the affidavit that shows that they were married on that date by Felix Patterson. And supposedly Frances Marion Roberts and Sarah were both present at that. Now I'll talk about that in a little bit. But they get married, and then they leave the creek bottom. And they go, and the census captures them that they're over in the Granville post office area. And that could have a lot more research, because we don't really know where they were renting or living, but we know that they weren't on the creek bottom. And we know that she moved up there, and 5 months after they got married, then Mary Lee was born on the 22nd of February, 1854. And we have several Mary Lee descendants right here. As their Mary Lee is born, just short 2 months later, Violet's daughter Joseph dies. Now Joseph had been doing a lot of land accumulation. And I'm going to show you a little bit of this, and I know that you're not all going to be able to see, but you can study this later on. And this is a depiction of down from the creek bottom and the different land areas that came from the early Roberts land settlements. So, and what you'll see is that besides the land grant that we always talk about on the Minelet Creek, you'll find out that Joseph Roberts also got another land grant down there closer to the Rose Garden, closer to where Violet ends up being. Okay, so I will let you guys see this, but this shows you the different farms and the different areas that Joseph Roberts accumulated land. When Joseph Roberts dies, he's accumulated over 1,000 acres of land. And he leaves a dowry to Mary for 275 acres. He leaves a dowry, and the interest in the other land is left to all the other children that are alive at that time. For whatever reason, that land is either sold, their interest is sold, or they lose the land due to taxes. So just keep that in your mind. But at that point in time when Joseph dies, Violet has a share of the land that was left behind. She has another son, Violet does, and on the 10th of December in 1858, Cornelius Denton Lee. He went by Bud. And Cornelius Denton, I often wonder if Denton came from her brother, Joseph Denton. Don't know, but it does seem to be a possibility. And then, what happens is the land starts changing interests and changing hands. And this does not pertain directly to Violet, but I want to share with you. In December of 1854, Sarah, the oldest daughter of Joseph Roberts, sells her interest of the land to Melissa Roberts, her sister. Melissa, who ended up marrying William Alexander Cronk. Melissa ends up living down there very much next door to Joseph Denton and to Violet. And I'll show that later as well. And in September of 1854, John Harrison Roberts, Violet's brother, sells his share of his land. So what you see is a lot of the land was getting sold to different people, and then someone didn't pay taxes, and the land, the 1,000 acres, somehow shrunk. We'll say it like that. But my grandfather, Clavis Roberts, he used to say when he would drive my dad on Old Baxter Road, he would say, yeah, at one point in time, Roberts owned all this land. And at the time, my dad was like, he always thought of the Roberts land being down here on the creek bottom. But in actuality, Joseph, at one point in time, did own all that land that my grandfather pointed out. So those stories that are passed down that you might not understand ends up sometimes being very accurate. Sometimes not, but sometimes it's very accurate. So what happens in the 60s? The 60s brings about tough times because the Civil War gets kicked off, right? And so in this area, especially for those people who don't know, in this area we had people that fought for the Union and fought for the Confederacy. And you could have one holler, this holler here that Francis Marion was in, they all fought for the Union. Next holler over, they all fought for the Confederacy. And it was a very tough time. We even have brothers against brothers in some families that fought against each other. And with that came a lot of tough times as far as which side are you going to fight for. And sometimes the Confederate soldiers would force you under gunpoint to fight for the Union, and vice versa. So there was a lot of people trying to maybe not fight right away. They were trying to take care of their family and their farms, but eventually it got to the point where people started to have to make decisions on where they were going to fight for. So in November 1862, and many of you guys already know this story, but Violet's brothers, Henry, Francis Marion Roberts, and Joseph Denton, all leave here to go to Nashville to join up, to include Henry's son, Joseph M. Roberts. That would be Violet's nephew. They all go up to Nashville, and they join up in the Union, Company I, 5th Tennessee Cavalry. So you guys can file that away because that's where most of our relatives fought for there. And just shortly after arriving, the 20th of December, 1862, her nephew dies, and in the Nashville hospital. We're talking November to 20th December. And then his father, Henry, who's in Murfreesboro, he dies February 1863, 2 months later. So right there in a short span, they decide to go fight. Violet loses her brother and a nephew just right away, not even having picked up arms due to chronic diarrhea and other things that caused them to die at that time. In February 1863, if you are looking at different types of Civil War pension applications and their military records, many of you will see that Francis Marion Roberts and Joseph Denton were listed as deserted at that time, February 1863, from a train near Murfreesboro. And so a lot of people are like, they deserted? Well, back then, if you look at Company I, especially 5th Tennessee Cavalry, there was a lot of people that deserted. But in actuality, they were either given permission to go back to their where they lived to get more soldiers to fight with them, or they would be captured, or they would go home and take care of family business because their heart was to take care of their family. So they needed to take care of family, they would do so. So there is speculation that my dad and I have talked about, Francis Marion and Joseph Denton lose their brother. And so what happened? What happened to his body? Did Francis Marion and Joseph, did they need to come back here to take care of family business? We don't know for sure, but what we do know is that later on, Joseph Denton in his affidavit says that Captain Anderson gave them permission to get recruits on their way to, so they came back here to get recruits. I'm not sure if that's true or not, but that's what he testified. And what you'll find out in Civil War affidavits is oftentimes they said and testified to things that helped their family. And so that was in Joseph Denton's affidavit. Additionally, Violet's sister, Melissa, she's married to William Alexander Cronk. And I see we have the Cronks come in right here, represented. And so her husband, William, and Joseph Denton and some other people gathered all the arms they could, and this is in Civil War affidavits as well. They gathered all of their arms that they could. They started going up to join up, and they were ambushed. And unfortunately, William Alexander Cronk was brutally killed, is what the testimony is, brutally killed. And so Melissa lost her husband, and before he was able to even muster in. And so that was a sad news. And Joseph Denton testifies to have been there, to be able to testify what happened to them. On February 1864, Francis Marion Roberts and Joseph Denton, they returned to Company I, 5th Tennessee Cavalry. They said that they had been captured and lost in action. So the desertion charges were removed. So that's just how things went for Company I, 5th Tennessee Cavalry. Later on, more and more of the area had to decide what to do in the Civil War. So Violet's sister, Marinda, her husband was William Browder Lee. He joins the Union Army, Company I, 1st Regiment, Tennessee Mounted Infantry. And then finally, Violet's husband decides to join up in February of 1865. And he enlisted with the Union, Company D, 8th Regiment, Tennessee Mounted Infantry in Nashville. He ends up only serving 6 months. And the reason being is while he was in Nashville, he contracts rheumatism. Now this is all according to affidavits. He contracts rheumatism, and he is in such bad condition that this is according to testimony, multiple testimonies, 2 men had to help him under each of his arms to get him to the steamboat which was going to take them down to Carthage. And so as soon as he arrives, he takes the steamboat down. He's carried. He can barely walk, apparently, according to the affidavits. And while he's in Carthage, he's put immediately into the hospital. He's there for a short amount of time, and Frances Marion Roberts tells Violet, so he must have somehow came from Carthage to come over here to this area, and he tells Violet that her husband is in very bad condition in the Carthage hospital. Violet, who's expecting, she's 4 months pregnant, and she has 2 children. We don't know how she did this, but she gets a wagon, she goes to Carthage, she sees the condition her husband's in. He's allowed to get a furlough, and so he's allowed to leave the Carthage hospital under her care. She brings him back here and takes care of him, and after the end of his furlough, he's ordered to go back to Nashville, to which case he was in such bad condition that the Union Army separated him from his service. But I kind of wonder, for those people in here, you think about how hard that must have been. She's 4 months pregnant. Carthage, for those people, it's a ways away, and she's going through a Confederate and fighting area. It goes to the point that the reputation that Violet always has had is she was a tough old bird. Now, was she a tough old bird when she was down in Minelet Creek and she caught the eye of John Wesley Lee? Maybe not. Maybe the Civil War and the fact that she was losing brothers, and maybe she was losing, her mom, maybe all these things contribute her to being resilient. Tough old bird makes her sound like she's not, not nice. Maybe she was just had to deal with what life gave her, and she had that reputation of being a tough old bird. So after John Wesley Lee comes home, their daughter is born shortly thereafter, Amanda, and we have Amanda descendants right here, and she's born August 1865 in Jackson County. So the war ends. I'm going to get out of the wartime period. The war ends, but it doesn't really end around here. Many of you guys have heard of the different types of revenge killings that happen. You've heard about how it was very tough as far as people trying to figure out how to make ends meet, what to do. And so in 1867, John Wesley Lee and Violet are arrested for tippling. Okay? So they were looking for a way, possibly, I'm not making a defense for them, but they were trying to figure out a way to make a living and a way to raise their family in a post-war situation. So tippling, for those who don't know, is when you sell illegally moonshine. Okay, this is not really moonshine, this is water, but I just wanted to give it for a demonstration. Now, this goes to how Violet was a tough old bird. Her and John are both arrested for tippling. The charges, for some unknown reason, when you go through the court documents up in Cookeville, for whatever reason, her husband, the charges is dropped, but they keep them against the woman. Very unusual. And so then she ends up getting a security bond posted by her brother, John Harrison Roberts, who, by the way, has a permanent chair in the courthouse up there because he's been in a lot of trouble. For those who were here last year, John Harrison Roberts. He was up at the he had been indicted for 2 different murders, but he did post some security bond for Violet, and Violet's like, no, you have to put me to jail. I'm not turning in or whatever. And so they end up dropping the charges against Violet. She wins out of pure stubbornness, is what I can tell in the court documents. And so no one went to jail for tippling, which is good, right? But her brother, John Harrison Roberts, like I said, he's been indicted for 2 different murders, and he ends up in July of 1870. For those who were here last year, he's plowing corn down there, and he is shot, and the story is told that they bring him up to his first wife's house, most likely because she was the closest house. He's brought up there, and the story is that he told his son, remember, gave him the rifle and said, remember the man who shot your father. And so that's the story in John Harrison Roberts, a little snippet on there. But bottom line is Violet lost another brother that she loved. In the 1870 census, she is living with her husband and her children in the District 13 Putnam County. And so then she starts having her children start getting married. So 1872, Mary marries John Bird Carr. So that happens. And then her daughter, on the 21st of July, 1873, Frances Marion R. Lee was born. Now, I told you before that I think there was a special bond between Frances Marion Roberts and Violet, because if you look at her daughter, she names her daughter Frances Marion R. Lee, maybe possibly after her brother. I'm guessing. We have no evidence other than that's what her name was, and I'm surmising that. So she has all of her children are alive, her husband's alive, everything is, after the war, things are possibly getting better. But then 9 March 1878, John Wesley Lee dies from his Civil War rheumatism, is what is told. The story goes from Miss Lois Anderson that he wanted to be buried on the Tucker Ridge. But because of Confederate sympathizers, they didn't want him to be buried there. This is all a story passed down. And so in the dark of night, they buried him in the Roberts No. 2 cemetery. So if you go to the Roberts No. 2 cemetery in Hickey, you guys were there yesterday, you'll see John Wesley Lee's tombstone there. So then Violet has children, and she's a widow. She does have land, and she is caught in this, or she's captured in the census as living with her oldest son. She's still listed as the head of the house, but Cornelius is there with her, as is daughter Frances. Mary and Amanda are married, so they're not listed in that census, because Amanda, your line, had married Samson Smith in June of 1880, and they have several children. And what's interesting about the Amanda and the Samson Smith line is the Smiths are also, their land is right up next to Violet Lee and Joseph Denton and Melissa Cromp's land over there. The Smiths are also over there. Joseph Denton marries Sylvie Smith. So we know that there's interaction with the Smiths and the Robertses there. I would love, if any of you have any information on this, because I studied it quite a bit, Amanda and Samson, they get married, they have several children, but from the 1900 census to the 1910 census, they both died. We don't have any death certificate. We don't know how they died. We don't know when exactly they died. There is some things on Ancestry Tree that I will just say is wrong. We don't know when they died. We have no evidence of that. And so their children were either of age to live on their own, or they were shared with other family members. So Amanda's youngest daughter, Opal Smith, she lived with Frances Marion Roberts Lee and her husband Harvey. Okay, and we'll go a little bit more on that later. In this time period, something wonderful kind of happens for Violet, because even though John Wesley Lee only served for 6 months, she files for a Civil War widow's pension, and she successfully gets it. And you compare that to Melissa, her sister, whose husband was brutally killed on his way to join up, and Melissa, who had a boatload of kids, she gets nothing. She applies for a pension and she gets nothing. But Violet is lucky and blessed because she gets a pension. And so she gets pension for having 2 kids under the age of 16, and then hers. The story goes that Violet sunk all of her pension money into land. My grandfather said she used to sink all of her money into land. And we have evidence now that Frances Marion Roberts and Violet went together to procure some of that Joseph land back into the Roberts name. So you can also look at this later on when the presentation is done, but you'll see that the 1831 land grant that Joseph Roberts had for 320 acres, Violet and Frances Marion, her brother, in 1888 procure back, that's the large amount here, procure back the land. And then Violet gets the land here. I know you can't all see it, but Violet gets this land right here, and that's where we believe that her homestead was at. Now, I'm going to be very careful on how I say this. We do not know exactly where Violet's homestead was at. We know of the home that her daughter, Frances Marion Roberts, and Harv Hurd, we know that home, and we do know that Frances took care of Violet in her old age, but we don't know if that was the same house. We suspect not, if that was the exact same house that Violet lived in. Okay, so I want to be careful when I say that, but we'll cover a little bit more. Does everyone know where this land is about? Shake your head if you do or you don't. Okay, so you don't, so I'm gonna highlight here. If you go down Old Baxter Road down here, and that's what this road here is, you're gonna have the railroad to your right, and then you're gonna have the interstate to your right, okay? And so what we do know is that Violet Roberts sold a right-of-way to the railroad to come through her land. This is also where I think that Violet was extremely smart, or she had the counseling of a wise brother, maybe Frances Marion, because when you look at the land deeds in Cookeville of all the people who bought or who sold land to the railroad, there's only 2 people in all those deeds that asked for anything other than cash. That was Frances Marion Roberts and Violet Lee. Violet Lee said, yes, I will sell you, but you have to give me all the timber, and you have to build me a cattle guard, a cattle crossway over to my land. That also gives us clue as to where this land was at. Frances Marion, of course, we know the story. Frances Marion says, we want to have a switch for a side rail for the train here so that farmers can sell their things there, thus the name of Robert Switch, which we all know about. So anyways, I'm going to pass this around so you guys can study it as you go through. But if you were, to your question, when you go down there, you will see that the house, which used to be right in the middle of the interstate, this is Frances Marion and Harv Hurd's house, was moved from there up slightly off of Howard Herron Road. I'll take you on a trip, okay? Okay. In the pension application that Violet gets, she has to get testimony, and this also goes to Violet's character, because Alfred Jones put in his testimony, he said, Mrs. Violet Lee was considered a good, loyal citizen during the late war and has always been considered a virtuous and truthful, honest lady, and has since soldiers remained a widow. So she had a good reputation, and so that's something to be, I think, proud of. In 1888, Violet's sister, Miranda, who had married William Browder Lee, she has to deal with some stress because Miranda's husband converts to LDS, and then he ends up going out to Utah, and his wife, Miranda, stays here. Her tombstone is in the Lee Cemetery over there that you see off the interstate. So that's a different story, and I will just give you a little highlight that guess who we're going to be focusing on next year? Miranda. So anyways, it could be an interesting thing. I told you how Violet sold the easement to the railroad, and then Frances marries Harv Hurd in 1890, and at that point in time, Violet has 17 grandchildren. In June 1894, Violet decides, and this is also very interesting to me, I've thought about it a lot, she deeds 140 acres of her land to 3 grandchildren. Okay, I already told you she had 17 grandchildren, right? She deeds 3 grandchildren upon her death. John Henry Lee, the son of Cornelius, William Casto Hurd, the son of Frances and her husband Harv, and then Frances Smith, Amanda's daughter. Those are the 3 that she deeds the land to. But wait, later on, Violet changes her mind, and in December of 1906, she is not pleased with those grandkids. And so she says, I revoke that. I don't want to leave this land to them. For whatever reason, she doesn't say why. She goes, but now I'm going to deed it all to Frances Marion Hurd, who's going to take care of me in my old age. So, kind of interesting. I don't know why she only picked those 3 grandkids. Was it because they were of age to have land? I don't know. Or were they her favorite? I don't know. Us grandmas don't have any favorites, but maybe Violet did. I don't know. In June 1900, Sister Miranda dies. And then in 1901, her brother Joseph Denton dies. In 1901, her sister Sarah dies. And in 1904, her daughter Mary dies. And in the 1900s, I already told you Amanda and Samson died. And in 1907, 1910, her sister Melissa dies, leaving Frances Marion and her. And January of 1912, Frances Marion Roberts dies, leaving Violet Roberts to be the last one of her siblings to live from Joseph Roberts. And in the 1900 and the 1910 census, Violet Roberts is pretty much just staying with her daughter Frances, who takes care of her, and her husband Harv, and then later on her kids William Casto and Theophily. Those were the ones that she stayed with. In her death certificate, Violet is said to have had cancer of the mouth or on the face. But there was probably other reasons that she could have died, but it does list that was something that she was dealing with. And we have been looking, and people have been trying to help me find a picture of Violet. So if you have one in your closet that you've been holding on to, you might want to share it with us, because we've been looking. But possibly Violet didn't want her picture taken because maybe she had something that she didn't really want to have a picture taken at that time. So Violet dies in March of 1923, and she is buried in the Smelledge Cemetery. For those who went to the Smelledge decoration, you might have noticed that Violet Lee, of all the tombstones, when you look out at that era, hers is the biggest. Now, I kind of wonder about that. I think that's kind of a funny story. Like, did she already have that already paid for, or did Frances just love her mom so much that she wanted to give her a bigger one than everybody else? Who knows? But I think it's kind of appropriate that Violet had a big, huge tombstone. Now, you could say, well, why did Violet go to Smelledge and not Roberts number 2 with her husband? I don't know. If you guys know, let me know. And then all of her children are buried in different locations as well, right? At this point in time, in my family tree maker and in my dad's, we have Violet as having 3,200 plus descendants. We have that documented, and if you ever are on Ancestry.com, you can look at those, and not all of them are alive, but you can see the ones that we have listed, and correct us if we're wrong and add to them, because we know we don't have all of them. But of those 3,200 folks, we had different migration paths. So for Mary's line, we had some folks that went down to Hillsborough, Florida, right? The strawberry picking area and all of that. In the Cornelius line, some of them went to Akron, Ohio, some to Walling, Tennessee, some to Manchester, Tennessee. So they had different migrations out of here. In Amanda's line, we had some that went to Fulton County, Indiana, Hillsborough, Florida, Detroit, Michigan, Peru, Indiana, Springfield, Illinois. And of all of the 4 kids of Violet, Amanda's line is the one that migrated the most. Could it be because Amanda and her husband Samson died when the kids were little? Maybe that's why they migrated to different places. That's just a possibility. In the Frances line, we had the one, Kenneth, that went to Guam through the military, and then we have one, Stanley, that went to San Diego, but then ended up returning to Tennessee. So these migration patterns show you that while a lot of folks stayed here in this area of Tennessee, we also have folks that migrated out, and that's why we have family members in Michigan and Ohio and all of that. And so it's good to have a reunion to bring them together and talk about their family history. So when I look at Violet, she was born lived her entire life here in this area of Tennessee. She had 4 children. She lost 2 of them at the 2 children died at 2 daughters at a fairly young age. She had a lot of grandchildren, some that probably pleased her, some that probably did not. She had a husband who, until the day that he died, we have no evidence of anything that they had, nothing but a happy marriage. She was willing to go to Carthage in a wagon to go pick him up in the middle of a war. And then she never remarried. She stayed right here and she never remarried. She raised the kids, and she had kids that took care of her in elderly age. And I think all of these things contributed to Violet having a very good reputation, as we heard from Alfred Jones' testimony. But then also she had children that also stayed in this area and are buried in this area. All of them are buried here in this area of Tennessee. Interesting side note, of all of Joseph Roberts' daughters, all of them who lost their husband never remarried, and they all stayed here in Tennessee. Just a side note. I want to, at this point in time, highlight a few things that we have on Violet. One of the stories that my grandfather shared is that, or not my grandfather, the story came down through my grandfather's sister, Aunt Ira, is that Violet would, to get money, she would drive ducks down to Buffalo Valley and she would sell them and then get a year supply of laudanum. And that, I don't know if I'm saying that right, but it's a type of opiate. Now, I'm not saying Violet was, hooked on opiates. I'm not saying that. She might have needed it for the cancer. She might have needed it for other reasons. We don't know. But this is my little jar of that to represent that on the table. We also know that she dealt with some moonshine, and we also know approximately where her daughter lived. And in that area where her daughter lived, my mom, is my mom here? There she is. My mom, we were driving around the different homesteads looking at jonquils. Jonquils are these white flowers that come up. We always talk about the buttercups. The buttercups are a certain generation of flowers, but before that generation, the older generation had jonquils. So if you look over in my mom's flower garden, you'll see that there are jonquils from the different homesteads of Joseph Roberts. And we wanted to share that with you. And my mom, we were looking for possibly where Francis and Violet might have lived. And my mom looked over, and right in the interstate right away there in the middle, she's like, there's some jonquils. And so we said, that's got to be it. And so we ended up going and digging up some jonquils so that we could share Violet's homestead with you, or Violet where she lived with her daughter Frances. My dad won't let me call it Violet's homestead. But in here are jonquil bulbs that I wanted to give each of you, and my mom wanted to give each of you to take with you to plant in your yard to remember Violet by. So I'm going to pass this along. If you'll pass that, please take it. And the ones that we have left over, we'll give to those tomorrow that weren't able to make it today. Yeah, and then the other thing that I'm going to ask help on is, you see that big stack of paper there on that table? That came from the house that was moved off the interstate that currently Mark Hurd owns it, and in the attic were pictures that were belonging to William Casto Hurd, whose mom was Frances. And there are pictures in there of Frances and other folks, but there are pictures in there that we have not been able to identify. So if you have time, as you're enjoying the music or whatever, grab a stack, grab a pen, and if you are 100% sure of who somebody is, please write it there, and that way we can update the pictures and keep that for them. All right. Now my dad thinks that I've glamorized Violet and that she was like a perfect woman and all of that. I am not saying Violet was a perfect woman, but I have enjoyed this last 9 months studying about her, and I hope that you've learned a little bit about her and that you've enjoyed it as well. So we'll take a break now, and we'll come back for an exciting DNA update on Joseph Roberts. Thank you.